Do you ever feel overwhelmed by everything you have to do? Do you ever wish you could slow down time and just relax? Well, if you're feeling that way, just remember that it could be much worse. You could be living in the Middle Ages, when the average person had to work from sunrise to sunset just to survive. The Middle Ages were a time period in European history that lasted from the fall of the Roman Empire in the West in the 5th century, the beginning of the Renaissance in the 15th century. This was a period of about 1,000 years, which is a lot of time for big changes to happen. But don't be fooled. For most people, life didn't really change all that much during this period. The average person lived and died in the same village, doing the same work as their parents and grandparents had done before them. The medieval world was dominated by the rhythms of nature, the planting and harvesting of crops, the mating and rearing of animals, the changing of the seasons. These things determined when people woke up and went to bed, what they ate, how they made money, and even how they celebrated holidays. If you wanted to get ahead in the medieval world, you had to be born into the right family. If your father was a peasant, you would probably be a peasant too. Your job would be to grow food or raise animals for your lord, the person who owned the land that you lived on. In return for your labor, your lord would give you a small piece of the land to farm yourself and maybe a house to live in. You would also be expected to give your lord a portion of the food that you grew and perhaps serve him in his army when he went to war. If you were lucky enough to be born into a noble family, your life would be much more comfortable. You would live in a fancy castle instead of a hut and wouldn't have to worry about growing your own food. But you would still have to participate in jousting tournaments and go to war when your lord called on you. That was just part of being a member of the nobility in the Middle Ages. But if you were really lucky, you could become a member of the clergy, the people who ran the church. As a member of the clergy, you would get to wear cool robes and live in a monastery where you could devote your life to God. It was also considered an honor to be a member of the clergy, because it was believed that only godless people became monks or priests. For most people, however, life in the Middle Ages was just hard. There were famines, plagues, and wars. And if you weren't careful, you could easily end up dead. It wasn't unusual for people to die from starvation or disease, and if you were a soldier, you probably died in battle. If you were a woman, your life was especially hard because you couldn't own property or make contracts, couldn't even vote. But you did have one advantage. During the Middle Ages, you could become a powerful person if you were born female. You could become the queen. But now, let us explore the medieval village in detail. This is where most people lived in the Middle Ages. There were usually between 200 and 500 people in a medieval village, and most of them were farmers. The village was surrounded by fields and farmlands, and the people who lived there farmed the land and raised animals. They also had a church, a school, a well, and a graveyard. And in the middle of all this was a large manor house where the Lord lived. Now let's meet some of the people who lived in a medieval village. First, we have Thomas the miller. Thomas is a miller because he owns a water mill that grinds grain into flour. He works hard from sunrise to sunset, and he's usually covered in flour, so he wears a white tunic. Next, we have Agnes, the baker. She wakes up early in the morning and kneads dough. She bakes bread, cakes, and pies, and she sells her goods at the market. Agnes is important to the village because everyone needs to eat. Then there's William the smith. He's the village blacksmith, and he makes horseshoes, tools, and weapons. William is also a strong man, and he has a booming laugh that echoes through the village. And finally, there's Father John, the village priest. He says prayers for the people of the village, and he performs religious ceremonies such as baptism and last rites. Father John is respected by everyone in the village, and he's always willing to help those in need. These are just a few of the people who lived in a medieval village. Everyone had an important role to play, and together they made the village thrive. Now, if you wanted to travel to a neighboring village, you would have to walk. There are no cars, trains, or buses in the Middle Ages. So if you wanted to get somewhere, you had to do it on foot. Walking was also the main form of exercise in the Middle Ages. People didn't have gyms or treadmills, so they just walked whenever they needed to move around. Of course, walking was also the main way that people got around in the Middle Ages. There were no cars or bikes, so everyone walked everywhere. This included merchants, soldiers, and even kings. In fact, King Henry VIII of England was so fond of walking that he once took a stroll of more than 60 miles without stopping. Walking was also an important part of medieval religious life. In fact, many Christians made pilgrimages of more than 100 miles to visit holy sites. The most famous pilgrimage route was the Camino de Santiago in Spain, which attracted more than 100,000 pilgrims each year. Walking was also a popular form of entertainment in the Middle Ages. In fact, there were organized walking competitions known as pedestrianism. The first recorded modern pedestrian race was held in England in 1529. Overall, walking was simply a fact of life in the Middle Ages. It was the cheapest and easiest way to get around. Most people didn't have any other choice. So if you ever complain about having to walk somewhere, just remember that it could have been much worse. It could have been walking from Canterbury to Rome. So to recap, during the Middle Ages, life was hard for most people. Worked long hours, they faced natural disasters, and they had few rights. However, they did have a strong sense of community, and they knew that they could count on their neighbors to help them out when times were tough. They also had a deep religious faith that gave them hope for a better life after death. Overall, despite the hardships they faced, the people of the Middle Ages were a resilient bunch. They were able to adapt to changing times, and they were able to endure some truly difficult circumstances. Hey, thanks for watching. You want to know more about life in the Middle Ages? Check out our other videos about medieval castles or medieval knights.